Moving into a new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start for me. After the chaos of a messy breakup and the stress of a job that seemed to consume every waking hour, I needed a change. The building wasn't much to look at, just a nondescript, aging structure tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, but it was affordable, and more importantly, it was available. The first time I saw the place, it felt normal. A bit old, sure, with creaky wooden floors and walls that could use a fresh coat of paint, but it had a certain charm. The landlord was an older man, quiet and polite, who assured me that the building was safe, well maintained, and most importantly, peaceful. That's what I wanted, peace. I spent the first few days unpacking, settling in, and trying to make the apartment feel like home. Everything seemed to be going well. The neighbors were friendly enough, though I didn't see much of them. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, which suited me just fine. I wasn't looking for new friends. I just wanted a place where I could sleep, work, and forget about the outside world. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on that first night, and the building's usual daytime noises faded away, something else began to fill the silence. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, just on the edge of hearing, coming from the vent in my bedroom. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than the building's old pipes or maybe the wind outside. I was tired, and my mind was still racing from the whirlwind of moving. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was nothing, just the natural creaks and groans of an old building. But as I drifted off to sleep, the sound persisted. A low, soft murmur, like a distant voice trying to speak through a thick wall. It was so faint that I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, almost human. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something in that vent, something, or someone, trying to reach out. And that was only the beginning. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that old buildings make strange noises. The landlord had mentioned that the ventilation system was ancient and prone to clanking and groaning when the wind picked up or the temperature shifted. I clung to that explanation as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me. But the sound wasn't like any vent noise I'd ever heard before. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It would start and stop, almost as if something was trying to form words. I found myself straining to hear it more clearly, but every time I thought I could make out a syllable, it would fade, leaving me with nothing but the eerie feeling that someone, or something, was whispering just out of earshot. I turned on my side, pulling the blankets up to my chin, trying to block out the sound. But it didn't work. The murmur continued, soft but persistent, filling the room with a sense of unease that made my skin crawl. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Was it really just a vent? I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was more than just an old building settling. There was something intentional about it, something that seemed directed at me. But that was ridiculous, right? The idea that a vent could produce anything more than random noises was absurd. And yet, as the minutes ticked by, that faint whisper seemed to grow louder in my mind. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. My dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, dark shapes that slithered just out of sight, voices that called to me from the darkness. When I woke up the next morning, I was more tired than when I'd gone to bed, my body sore and my mind foggy from a night of restless tossing and turning. The voice was gone in the morning light, as if it had never existed. The apartment was quiet, the air in the vent still. I shook off the unease that had settled over me during the night, convincing myself that it was just nerves. Moving to a new place was stressful, and I'd been through a lot lately. Of course, I was going to feel a little off. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper. It lingered in the back of my mind like an unwelcome guest, making me jump at every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the windows. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing to worry about, but the memory of that faint, desperate voice haunted me. By the time the sun began to set again, I was dreading the coming night. I tried to distract myself with TV, scrolling mindlessly through shows and movies, but nothing held my attention. I kept glancing over at the vent, half expecting to hear that soft murmur again. And when I finally crawled into bed, the blankets pulled up tight around me, I lay there in the dark, listening, waiting. That night, the whispering started earlier. I noticed it as soon as I turned off the light. It was more distinct this time, less like a distant murmur and more like a voice. A real voice. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a cadence to it, a rhythm that felt unmistakably human. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to get up, turn on the light, and maybe even run out of the apartment. But I couldn't move. I was caught in some twisted curiosity, a need to understand what I was hearing, even though every part of me was screaming that I didn't want to know. I strained to listen, trying to piece together the sounds, but it was like the voice was just beyond the edge of comprehension, teasing me with fragments of syllables that never quite formed into words. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to communicate something urgent, something important, but it was too faint, too distant. And then, for the briefest moment, I thought I heard a word. Help! The sound was so soft, so delicate, that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, though still barely audible. Help me! A cold shiver ran down my spine. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was speaking to me through the vent. The voice was small, weak, as if it was coming from far away or being muffled by layers of thick insulation. But it was there, and it was real. I sat up in bed, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but my throat felt tight, my voice strangled by fear. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the vent, listening to the voice repeat its desperate plea. Help me! Finally, I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling. Who are you? For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then the voice came again, clearer now, though still soft and broken. Please, help me! I threw off the blankets and stumbled out of bed, moving toward the vent like I was in a trance. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I knelt down beside the vent, pressing my ear against the cool metal, straining to hear more. Who are you? I whispered, my voice shaking. Where are you? There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought the voice had gone. But then it came again, so faint it was almost drowned out by the sound of my own breathing. Trapped, help! A surge of panic washed over me. Someone was trapped, maybe somewhere in the building, or maybe even in the walls. I didn't know how that was possible, but the voice sounded so desperate, so real, that I couldn't ignore it. I scrambled to my feet and rushed out of the bedroom, flicking on every light as I went. I needed to do something, find the landlord, call the police, anything to get help for whoever was trapped in that vent. But as I reached the door to my apartment, I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if this was just some bizarre trick of acoustics, a weird fluke of the old ventilation system? I couldn't just go banging on doors in the middle of the night, telling people I'd heard a voice in my vent. But what if I was right? What if someone really was trapped and needed my help? My mind raced, torn between fear and the need to act. And then, in the silence of my hesitation, the voice came again, clearer and more desperate than before. Please, don't leave me! That was enough. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called the police. I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I wasn't going to ignore that voice. When the police arrived, I was almost relieved to have someone else there to hear the voice, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. 2 officers, a man and a woman, entered my apartment, their faces set in expressions of professional calm. They asked me to explain what I'd heard, and as I recounted the story, I could see the doubt in their eyes. But they didn't dismiss me outright. Maybe it was because I was so clearly shaken, or maybe they'd seen enough strange things on the job to know that sometimes the unbelievable was true. The male officer, Officer Davis, led me back to the bedroom where I'd heard the voice. The female officer, Officer Ramirez, stayed near the door, her hand resting lightly on her radio. I pointed to the vent, my voice trembling as I spoke. It was coming from there. Someone's trapped. I heard them asking for help. Officer Davis knelt beside the vent, pressing his ear to the metal. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching out longer than the last. I held my breath, waiting for the voice to return, for some proof that I wasn't just hearing things. But there was nothing. The vent was silent. He stood up, glancing at me with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. Sometimes old buildings make strange noises. It could have been anything, a draft, the wind, or even the building settling. Are you sure you didn't imagine it? No, I protested, my voice rising with desperation. I know what I heard. It was a voice, a person asking for help. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. We believe that you heard something, but it's also possible that stress or anxiety might have caused you to misinterpret the sound. Moving to a new place can be overwhelming. I felt a wave of frustration and fear. They didn't believe me. They were going to leave, and that voice, that person, would still be trapped, still calling for help. I couldn't let that happen. Please, I begged, tears welling up in my eyes. Just check the vent or the walls. Do something. What if someone really is trapped? The officers exchanged a glance, and I could see them weighing their options. Finally, Officer Davis nodded. All right, we'll take a look. Just to be sure. They called for maintenance, and within half an hour, an older man with a toolbox arrived. He introduced himself as Carl, the building's superintendent. He seemed less than thrilled to be there in the middle of the night, but after the officers explained the situation, he agreed to inspect the vent. Carl removed the vent cover, shining a flashlight inside. I stood behind the officers, watching anxiously, my heart pounding in my chest. He peered inside for a long moment, then reached in with a gloved hand, feeling around. There's nothing in here, Carl finally said, his voice gruff. No signs of anyone or anything. Just some dust and cobwebs. My stomach sank. This wasn't possible. I knew what I'd heard. I hadn't imagined it. But the evidence, or lack thereof, was against me. I could see the doubt solidifying in the officers' expressions. Is there any chance the sound could be coming from somewhere else in the building? Officer Ramirez asked. Carl shook his head. Not likely. The vents are isolated to each apartment. No shared airways between units. If there was a sound, it had to come from inside this apartment. The officers thanked Carl, who replaced the vent cover and left, grumbling under his breath. They turned to me, their expressions softening. We'll file a report, Officer Davis said. If you hear anything else, don't hesitate to call us. But for now, it seems like there's nothing here. They were trying to be kind, but their words only deepened my sense of dread. They didn't believe me, and now, I was alone with that vent, and the voice that I knew was real. After they left, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the vent. The silence in the room was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I wanted to believe the officers were right, that it was all just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. That voice was real. And it was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to hear it again. After the police left, the silence in my apartment was suffocating. It was different from before, heavier, more oppressive. Even though I knew I was alone, it felt like the walls were closing in, like the very air was thick with something unseen. I tried to go back to bed, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again, faint and pleading, echoing in my mind. Help me! The words haunted me, replaying over and over until they were all I could think about. I found myself drawn back to the vent, sitting on the floor beside it, listening intently for any sign of the voice's return. Hours passed, and the night wore on, but there was nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that crawls under your skin and makes you question everything. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through my window, I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just dismiss what I'd heard as a trick of the mind or a weird quirk of the building. I knew it was real. I knew someone, or something, was trying to reach out to me. Over the next few days, I became consumed by the mystery of the voice. I started searching the internet for any clues, looking up everything I could find about strange noises, haunted buildings, and people trapped in walls. Most of it was nonsense, urban legends, ghost stories, and wild conspiracy theories. But some of it seemed disturbingly close to what I was experiencing. I read about cases where people had been trapped in hidden rooms or forgotten spaces in old buildings, their voices lost to the outside world until it was too late. I found stories about spectral voices that had driven people mad, leading them to dig through walls or tear apart their homes in search of the source. And the more I read, the more I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something dark and dangerous. I started spending more and more time in my apartment, barely leaving except to grab food or supplies. My friends noticed my absence, but I ignored their calls and texts. I couldn't explain what was happening to me without sounding insane, and the last thing I needed was for them to start worrying or, worse, try to intervene. The voice hadn't returned since that first night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just waiting for the right moment to call out again. I found myself talking to the vent, pleading for the voice to come back, to tell me more. I needed answers, and the silence was driving me to the brink of desperation. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. Faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me!" I shot up in bed, my heart racing. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed over to the vent, pressing my ear against it. "Who are you?" I whispered urgently. "Where are you?" The voice was fainter than before, but I could just make out the words. "Trapped, please, help!" "I want to help," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't know how. Tell me where you are." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought the voice was gone again. But then it returned, so soft I had to strain to hear it. "Behind the walls." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The words confirmed my worst fears. Someone was trapped behind the walls of my apartment. But how? And why hadn't anyone found them before? I knew I couldn't go back to the police. They wouldn't believe me, not without more proof. I had to find the source of the voice on my own. The next day, I bought tools, a hammer, a crowbar, a small handsaw. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I had to start somewhere. I began by tapping on the walls, listening for any hollow spots, any sign that there might be a hidden space behind the drywall. It was slow, painstaking work, and the more I searched, the more the voice haunted me. It was always there, just out of reach, whispering its desperate plea. I barely slept, barely ate. My entire life became consumed by the need to find the voice, to free whoever was trapped behind those walls. Days turned into weeks, and my apartment became a maze of holes and exposed beams. My landlord stopped by a few times, furious about the damage, but I didn't care. I was close, I could feel it. I just had to keep going. But the closer I got, the more I started to question my own sanity. Was this real, or was I chasing a phantom, a figment of my imagination? The voice had become so much a part of my life that I couldn't imagine a reality without it. And that terrified me. I knew I was losing myself, but I couldn't stop. I had to find the truth, no matter what it cost me. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across town, far from the building that had once been my home. My heart pounded in my chest, and my lungs burned with every breath, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was still lurking in that apartment. I found myself at a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. The clerk barely glanced at me as I handed over cash for a room, my hands still shaking. Once inside, I locked the door, checked the windows, and collapsed onto the bed, my mind racing. But no matter how far I'd run, the voice was still with me. "Thank you for setting me free." The words echoed in my mind, refusing to be silenced. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was still reeling from the shock of what I'd discovered. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had been trapped in that wall wasn't gone. It had simply moved on. And it had left something behind, an imprint, a residue of its presence that clung to me like a shadow. For days, I holed up in that motel room, too afraid to return to my apartment, too afraid to talk to anyone. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the skeletal hand reaching out, heard the voice whispering in my ear. It was driving me mad, the constant, insistent presence that I couldn't escape. I tried everything, drowning it out with noise, numbing it with alcohol, distracting myself with TV. But nothing worked. The voice was a part of me now, ingrained so deeply in my mind that I couldn't tell where it ended, and I began. Finally, out of sheer desperation, I went to see a therapist. I told them everything, about the voice, the apartment, the discovery behind the wall. They listened patiently, their expression unreadable, before suggesting that it might be a coping mechanism, a manifestation of my subconscious mind reacting to stress or trauma. But I knew better. This wasn't something my mind had created. It was something real, something ancient and dark that had latched onto me, feeding off my fear and obsession. The therapist prescribed medication, but I didn't take it. I was too afraid of what might happen if I dulled my senses, if I let my guard down. I was convinced that the voice would take control, that it would consume me completely. Weeks passed, and the voice grew fainter, but it never disappeared entirely. It was always there, lurking in the background, a constant reminder of what I had uncovered. I couldn't go back to my old life, couldn't return to my apartment. I was a different person now, haunted, broken, living in the shadow of something I didn't fully understand. Eventually, I moved to a new city, changed my name, tried to start over. But even in my new life, I couldn't escape the past. I avoided small spaces, refused to stay in buildings with old, crumbling walls. And I never, ever listened to the silence. Because in the silence, I knew the voice was still waiting, still watching, still whispering its terrible thanks. I've learned to live with it, this lingering presence that follows me wherever I go. Some days I can almost pretend it isn't there, that I'm just like everyone else. But then, in the quiet moments, when the world is still and my mind starts to wander, I hear it again. Thank you for setting me free. And I know that no matter how far I run, no matter where I go, I'll never truly be alone.